has been beheaded. John Ridsdale was kidnapped 6 months ago. Egyptian security forces have suppressed attempts by anti-government protesters to hold rallies in the capital, Cairo. The demonstrators have been angered by a government decision to return 2 Red Sea islands to Saudi Arabian control. And a new study in Britain suggests that flu vaccines are more effective when they're given in the morning rather than later in the day.
Sue, thank you. You're listening to Business Matters on the BBC World Service. Coming up, more stories from around the globe, including the business of risk. What steps should companies take to ensure they can deal with global shocks? Plus why the glossy corporate brochures showing equal prospects for women at work should be ripped up, according to our regular commentator Lucy Kellaway of the Financial Times.
Most of the men are senior people, balding, grey, and pictured talking earnestly. The young, anonymous women are total babes.
Spain's southern city of Granada has been hit by political scandal in recent days, leading to several high-profile resignations. The latest developments come after Spain's industry minister, José Manuel Soria, stepped down after he featured in the Panama Papers, and a former economy minister and IMF managing director, Rodrigo Rato, is facing trial for tax fraud and other financial irregularities. A stream of similar cases is affecting different political parties, and the King of Spain has called urgent meetings that could lead to fresh elections. Kai Hedgeko reports.
A guitarist plays in the shade of Granada's cathedral as tourists walk by. It's a typically tranquil scene in this beautiful city, and yet in recent days, Granada has been hit by a political earthquake. The city's mayor, José Torres Hurtado, was arrested on April the 13th as part of a corruption investigation. He was released, but remains the target of a probe. Torres Hurtado has insisted he's innocent, although a few days after his arrest, he and 2 other members of the Conservative Popular Party in Granada resigned. I'm in the Serrallo shopping mall on the edge of Granada, and it's the place which has been at the very centre of the recent scandal involving the city's mayor. A plot of land behind the mall was earmarked for the installation of a children's park, but instead a restaurant, a nightclub and a skating rink were built there. Investigators say that in allowing the more profitable enterprise to be built, the mayor's office broke the law. Out on the streets of the city, locals are both angry and bemused by the recent developments involving their former mayor, who is accused of organising a web of corrupt activity.
We don't know everything about what's happening in Granada. There are many issues that we don't know. I'm worried about the situation of corruption because it's something that is not well investigated.
I don't really know what happened, but I do know he was stealing money, let's put it that way, and okay, it made me feel really stupid. And it's like, I don't mean anything to them.
Among those celebrating the resignation of the Conservative mayor is Podemos, the anti-austerity party which has put the battle against corruption at the heart of its agenda. Alberto Mataran is the party's leader in Granada, and he teaches urban planning at the city's university.
They have developed a city model based on the profit of the 1% of the population. They have developed an urban model based on big malls where the public space is not important for them, and the only question that is important is the idea of giving profits to those investors, to those hedge funds, in order to have more and more profits.
Spain's financial scandals are not limited to Granada.
Soy yo, Marina.
Marina, ¿cómo estás?
Bien.
Revelations from the so-called Panama Papers recently showed that a number of well-known Spaniards had held offshore companies, including Pedro Almodóvar, director of the hit film Tie Me Up, Tie Me Down. Meanwhile, the Panama Papers seem to have ended the career of Industry Minister José Manuel Soria. The governing Popular Party has been particularly affected by recent scandals, but the opposition's socialists have also been tainted. Last year, an estimated 500 politicians were investigated for corruption. Spain's political situation is uncertain after inconclusive elections in December failed to create a new government. It now looks likely the country will hold new elections in June. If so, the battle against corruption is almost certain to be at the centre of the election campaign.
And I'm sure Guy Hedgecoe will be bringing us updates on the election campaign when it happens. You've been listening to Business Matters on the BBC World Service. Much more to come after the news.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where the news will follow this.
Identity from the BBC World Service.
Throughout the world, there are people divided by faith, by politics, and by culture.
Humans have made their own structure of the society miserable for themselves, where they cannot live freely, love freely, talk freely, meet each other freely.
But there are often things that unite people across the borders that divide old enemies.
Same food, same music, same island mentality, our past 500 years.
I am Asad Ali, and as part of the BBC's Identity season, I'll be exploring music that ignores political boundaries.
Music that unites us.
Despite the division, love is in the air.
Sunday at 13 GMT.
You're listening to Business Matters from the BBC World Service with me, Susanna Streeter. Coming up in the next half hour, we're live in Hong Kong with a roundup of the news and business stories making the headlines. And we'll get lots more comment from our guest, Simon Littlewood from Asia Now Consulting, who's with me here in London, and Dante Dispati, who's in Washington. That's all after this latest world news.
BBC News. Ukraine is holding ceremonies to mark the 30th anniversary of Chernobyl, the world's worst nuclear accident. Sirens sounded at the exact moment of the first explosion in the plant's reactor in April 1986. The roof blew off and a cloud of radioactive materials spewed out, drifting across Ukraine's borders into Belarus and across a swathe of northern Europe. The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has expressed outrage at the killing of John Ridsdale, a Canadian hostage kidnapped by Islamist militants in the Philippines 6 months ago. He described the killing as a cold-blooded murder. A massive operation by Egypt's police and army has stifled attempts to hold anti-government demonstrations in Cairo. The protesters have been angered by a government decision to return 2 Red Sea islands to Saudi Arabian control. The Venezuelan Supreme Court has rejected a constitutional reform proposed by opposition politicians who wanted to reduce President Nicolas Maduro's term in office from 6 to 4 years. The opposition says Venezuela is in crisis because of years of left-wing economic policies. Thousands of demonstrators have been bussed into the state capital of North Carolina in the US to either support or oppose a new state law that imposes restrictions on transgender people. The law demands that people use toilets in public buildings that match the sex on their birth certificate rather than their gender identity. A study in Britain suggests that flu vaccines are more effective when they're given in the morning rather than the afternoon. Researchers found antibody response was stronger in those vaccinated before 11 a.m. And the European Space Agency has launched a Soyuz rocket carrying a probe that will test Einstein's theory of general relativity. BBC News.
Hello and welcome back to Business Matters with me, Susanna Streeter. Now, is the world a riskier place than it used to be? We're bombarded with warnings about climate change, terrorism, social unrest and cyber attacks. The rapid change in technology and the sharing of information certainly ensures that we're aware of such risks more than we would have been before the advent of 24-hour news and social media. Individuals can of course switch off if they feel what's happening on the other side of the world doesn't immediately affect them. But for many companies, ignoring the news could be disastrous. The risk management industry has sprung up to help firms deal with the impact of global shocks on their businesses. And one of my guests on the programme today, Dante Disparte, is the founder and CEO of Risk Cooperative, and he believes many firms simply aren't agile enough to respond when they need to. Hello again. Welcome back, Dante.
Thanks, Susanna. And yes, well, I don't think they are agile enough, and I think the phase one is we have to remember that I think we've changed era, where from 1900 until 2015 there was $7 trillion of economic loss due to natural risks. And I think today, as much of the program has highlighted with the Bangladesh case and the Saudi case, today much of the issues we face are man-made, and man-made risks have a very unique property, which is agency. The actor we have to contend with isn't passive, isn't capricious. It is a very deliberate actor. They have oftentimes no motives at all, and how organizations make decisions in the face of this type of environment has to adapt. And therefore, in my new book, Global Risk Agility, I'm calling for a much more agile entrepreneurial decision-making framework to inform the way large institutions, both non-profit, political, and for-profit, respond to this new time.
So you say that many risk managers are playing a perpetual game of catch-up. Why? What aren't they doing?
Well, I'll tell you what they are doing and what's wrong with what they're doing. Part of what they're doing is they're relying on the placebo effect of passive approaches, right? In financial institutions like the Central Bank of Bangladesh, by the time you notice you have a problem, $80 million are gone. And equally, our response to climate change. By the time you start to see weather impacts on the East Coast, or you get a large global sort of agreement on reducing carbon emissions, it perhaps is already too late. And right now we're in a time where we really need to make decisions, often in the absence of information, and we have to shift from the consensus-driven decision-making frameworks that large institutions are used to a nimbler decision-making framework.
But with such an array of risks and fears to be aware of, I gave you a list as we went into this. Isn't there a risk that companies could become too overburdened with what might happen and fearful of taking a risk that they need to progress their business?
True, and I wouldn't say at all that this is merely a lose-lose proposition. In fact, I think this is a time of great opportunity and therefore great upside for companies. And one example that stands out is companies like Apple and Starbucks here in the United States have really stayed ahead of bad news, information that would otherwise harm their stock prices, such as the workers' rights conditions in Foxconn. Apple got ahead of that, published a transparent global supply chain report, which now has become an industry standard, and other consumer electronics firms are trying to catch up with Apple. So Apple turned bad news into a game-changing move, and it wasn't just about hedging risk, it was really about getting ahead of it.
Simon, what's your take on this?
Yeah.
We're told to prepare for risks, aren't they? But risks can be good for business.
They can be, yes, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. I mean, companies that are concerned with the fact that the oil price is low might regard a perception of increased trading risk in the environment or supply risk as advantageous because it could increase the oil price. I agree with everything Dante said, and my experience with corporates is that the classic approach to risks is you make a list of risks in descending order of likelihood, highly likely to occur, less likely to occur, and then you say how big an impact would those risks have. So ones that are likely to occur and are going to have a major impact on your success need to be dealt with. But the issue is that to deal with them, it's not just the risk manager that has to worry about it. You then have to have a whole series of actions which are cascaded through line management, or in the event that you're preparing for a risk which may occur, you have to have a series of actions and behaviors that are, if you like, rehearsed like a fire drill, so that everyone understands what they are and you know quickly what you can do. You can deploy your media reaction, you can deploy your operational reaction. The reality is that's costly, it diverts a lot of time. You get a lot of interest in that kind of thing when something's just gone wrong, like someone stole $81 million. But do you actually, in normal running times, invest time in doing things like that? In my experience, organizations go off the boil and focus on other things,
There's a lot of apathy amongst those who are a lot further down the chain, thinking, oh God, I've got to go to that risk seminar again, something that's never going to happen. Dante, do you find that?
Oh, indeed, and I would argue that for companies to really thrive through these times, it is about making it everybody's business in a company to stay in business. And Unfortunately, the tone at the top is set by a lot of indifference, a lot of organizational remoteness, and therefore it translates lower down in organizational layers, and those closest to where they're going to see the smoke rising from floors below them have no incentive to raise the alarm bell and do something about it.
So, Simon, if you're taking steps to advise banks in Singapore, for example, on their risk management, what's number one priority?
Well, something occurs to me, and that's a very good question, is that there are many industries, including banking, where a willingness to take risk can lead to very high rates of return. So you've got a paradox here, which is, on the one hand, I want you to take responsibility for ensuring that there are no major risks and we don't come off the rails. But on the other hand, what you're actually going to earn your money from is very high returns, which imply a level of risk. So there's a conflict there, I think, in terms of behaviour. Large organisations focus on what people are measured on, and by and large, executives are not measured on how well they manage their risk mitigation strategies. They're measured on the returns that they bring to the organisation, and that's always going to be their focus, yeah?
So should there be, do you think, Dante, a change to remuneration packages to reflect this?
Well, I think, Simon hit the crux of one of the principal challenges we face in the modern economy, which is that the human behaviors and the incentive systems and value systems of those behaviors are not aligned. And companies that get exposed to cyber risk, for example, if they lived by their corporate value statements, those nice words they have emblazoned in their annual report and in their lobbies, they would have less fear of unwanted disclosure, right? And indeed, there has to be a serious look in the mirror at corporate compensation. There has to be a look in the mirror at the alignment of those steering companies and governing large institutions and how they fit with the times that we're in.
Absolutely. Okay, Dante Disparte, thank you. Simon Littlewood, thank you as well. I want to tell you about a story that has a bearing on all of this, because one of the world's largest investment banks appears so aware of the growing appetite to minimise risks that its slogan for its new retail arm is "Welcome to Peace of Mind Savings." Wall Street-based Goldman Sachs has built itself a reputation as a financial powerhouse, serving billionaires and huge companies undertaking mega mergers, but it's now going after customers who want to open an account with as little as $1. So what's behind this move into online retail banking? That's a question I put to Daniel Lattimore, who's a senior banking analyst with Senate Research.
It's one of the beauties right now of what's happening in financial technology. A firm like Goldman, who has traditionally catered to very high net worth individuals, is now able, because it is doing this all online, to offer very small accounts that have very attractive interest rates for the customers, but rates that are still significantly below what they would have to pay in the institutional market.
To what extent are the new rules which are forcing banks to not rely so much on short-term funding behind this?
Oh, clearly they are a significant driver of this effort by Goldman. But it's interesting, they are only offering these savings products. They have no checking account. They have no robust online banking application. They have no mobile app. What they're clearly going after is rate hoppers who are still going to be relatively happy to park their money at Goldman for what is a relatively attractive interest rate compared to what's out there at many other institutions.
The thing is, after the financial crisis, there was this big move to try and persuade investment banks and get the regulators on board to ring-fence the more casino-type operations from the investment banks, from retail operations. This flies in the face of that, doesn't it?
Well, they're still going to clearly be insured by the FDIC here in the U.S. It is a new and different and diversified source of funding for Goldman. Depositors won't be at risk, but there's no doubt the regulators will be watching this very carefully.
Well, that was Daniel Lattimore from Senate Research. So Simon Littlewood is with me in the studio listening to this. This is all about minimising risk, isn't it?
Well, the banking industry is in a bit of a muddle, frankly. Because of the recent unpleasantness on Wall Street, where the world economy was almost brought to its knees because of foolishness in the banking sector and a failure to control risk, a number of rules were rolled out globally. Those of us that are in business feel that very many of these rules are annoying and probably useless in terms of reducing risk. And one of the immediate impacts of those rules if you run a small or a medium-sized enterprise is that banks simply can't be bothered to do business with you because they can't make enough money out of you to justify the significant additional risk that they may offend some regulation and get fined huge sums of money, and the fines are absolutely enormous. So I think we're now seeing this separation of business where they want to do business on the one hand with very large corporate customers and at the other end with small retail customers whose level of risk is generally perceived by the industry to be much, much, much lower. I would say that the overall level of trading risk for banks has not been reduced significantly by the raft of regulations. I would say the complexity of doing business has been, and to that extent it was an overreaction and a very poor example of risk management. Yeah?
Dante Disparte, what's your take? Do you think that actually by minimising risk to this extent, they risk not being profitable in the future by lending to those small businesses that could become extremely successful?
Well, you hit the nail on the head in terms of what is driving Goldman's entry into the retail banking domain. It is profits, right? For the first quarter of this year and for the last several quarters, they have not been doing very well at all. And the entry into the retail banking space is a little bit of a surprise, I think, to folks who got used to the Wall Street institutions privatizing gains and socializing losses. It's all of a sudden, Goldman has established a Main Street banking solution for as little as $1. But it feels a little bit like it's a distraction from its core strategy and its core competence of dealing with complex institutional investors. And it's a very, very crowded market. But ultimately what is motivating it is it's following the money and it's following the profits. That comparatively, a company like Discover Financial Services had a 21% return on equity, whereas Goldman's in the most recent round was 6%.
So with this move, it's trying to really focus on those savings rates. Hoggers, we'll have to see if that works. But now we've got to get an update from Sue with all the news.
The Saudi Arabian government has approved a plan for far-reaching reforms that are intended to modernise the kingdom's economy and reduce its dependence on oil. The government wants to increase taxes and cut spending. The International Monetary Fund says the dramatic drop in oil prices cost exporter states in the Middle East $390 billion in lost revenue last year compared with 2014. The IMF has warned that these countries must be ready for a further drop in income. And as we've been hearing, the investment bank Goldman Sachs has opened an online retail bank, taking deposits of as little as $1 for savings accounts. The move comes 8 months after the lender announced it would acquire GE Capital's online deposit arm, giving the company about $16 billion in accounts and certificates of deposit.